I imagine Lebanon to be 100% renewable based, with public transport the main mode of transportation, walkable cities where you don't need to have even the use of public transport, where every house has a rainwater harvesting system, every greenhouse plantation has a rainwater harvesting system, where every household is also equipped with energy efficient equipments, but also water efficient equipments.
فهاكن كاباكيان، أهلا وسهلا فيك بالموسم الثاني من انرجي اسبريسو، البودكاست من إنتاج UNDP وبدعم من الاتحاد الأوروبي. هو دائما بيقدم الحلول المستدامة لتحديات لبنان الاقتصادية البيئية والاجتماعية، وطبعا بيعالج مواضيع الطاقة المتجددة. ما تنسوا تتابعونا على مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي من يوتيوب وغيره، وطبعا عملوا سبسكريبشن. اليوم بدنا نحكي عن موضوع أكيد كل العالم مهتم فيه، وهو تغير المناخي ومؤتمر الأطراف كوب 28. لنحكي عن هالموضوع وأكثر، أهلا وسهلا فيك فهاكن كاباكيان، وحضرتك استشاري تغير مناخي. وبدنا كمان نذكر الجميع أنه هيدي الحلقة اليوم بدها تكون استثنائيا باللغة الإنجليزية. أهلا وسهلا فيك بأنرجي إسبريسو فهاكن. قبل ما نحكي تغير مناخي ومؤتمر أطراف وإلى ما هنالك، أول شيء عرفنا عن حالك.
Vahaken Kabakian, Climate Change Advisor, UNDP, Minister of Environment.
So before going into what's happening in Lebanon, maybe we should start with some basic introductions about what is climate change and how does it impact our daily lives.
Let me start with distinguishing two things. The natural, what we call greenhouse effect, and I'll explain what that means, and the man-made or man-caused greenhouse effect. So climate is different than weather. Weather is the daily changes. Climate is a long-term temperature, precipitation patterns, how much rain we're having, but on a long term. So even year on year, that might fall into weather patterns, but a decade, 50 years, 100 year, we're talking about climate. So this is the first distinction. The planet has an average temperature, global average temperature, which had we not have certain gases in the atmosphere, in the air, the planet's temperature would have been a good minus 18, 20 degrees than what we have now. We're around 15, 16 degrees now. So this is a comfortable temperature that we live in. And these temperatures are global average temperatures. So it depends if you're in the northern hemisphere, in Sweden, it's a colder weather temperature in general. And then you have the warmer temperatures. So depending on the topography of the country, location, and so on and so forth. So this is the first distinction. So those gases, which we refer to them as greenhouse gases, very simply because they do cause what we refer to as a greenhouse effect. The typical greenhouse of an agriculture installation. It traps heat and it keeps the heat inside, which helps producing cucumber and so on and so forth. So this is a natural greenhouse effect, very much based on a certain balance in the atmosphere of those gases. Because of our use since the Industrial Revolution of fossil fuel, primarily fossil fuel, but also clearing land, forests for agricultural purposes, to use to produce food and so on and so forth, we've been increasing those gases in the atmosphere. So over the years, with the Industrial Revolution, we're using diesel oil, gasoline, anything that we burn to generate electricity, even to burn heat. When we burn wood to produce heat in the house, we're emitting additional greenhouse gases. The most famous is the carbon dioxide. Mm-hmm. So we're increasing those levels in the atmosphere. So what we're seeing as climate change is very similar to when you're, on a hot summer day, you're sitting outside, the temperature is tolerable, you're wearing a t-shirt or a shirt, you're fine. But then they add a layer on you, a jacket. You start feeling a bit uncomfortable. Then they add another jacket on you, and so on and so forth. So you end up wearing your winter gear, ski gear. Your body starts reacting. You start feeling hot, and then you start sweating as a reaction. So it's a very similar process for the planet. Mm-hmm. We're increasing those gases, which are literally holding the heat in the planet, on the surface, which is causing those, what we refer to climate changes. So increase in temperature, which is causing and changing rainfall patterns, how much rain is falling, when it is falling, the quantity, and then all these two together impacts a series of different economic activities. Water availability, we have less water, too much water. Too much water could lead to droughts, floods. Less water leads to droughts. And then you have problems with producing food, agriculture, because they primarily rely on temperature and water availability.
So, and this is everything that we're seeing these days, like all these floods or droughts or fires, etc. So all of that, like we can say that it's because of this climate change effect or warming of the planet. But so can you tell us a bit about like the future? How will climate change affect our future?
So think about this, continuing our emissions. We're not taking any action. We will keep increasing the greenhouse effect, the man-made greenhouse effect, which will keep trapping heat, which will literally induce changes in temperature. So we're looking at global temperatures reaching 4 degrees, 5 degrees. So I'm talking about the average temperature of the planet. It could reach 8 degrees, depending on your location. So that with water, you would have primarily impacts on agriculture, as I said, food production, water availability, stresses on these two systems, but also in terms of energy demand. Usually if it's warmer, people start using more air conditioning. True. So from one end, you're using electricity and producing greenhouse gas, but at the same time, you need more energy to, in a way, protect yourself from the heat. So this is one side of the energy demand increase because of what the energy is causing primarily. The greenhouse gas effects. But also producing energy will be under stress. Power plants require cooling. And the warmer the weather is, the more difficult it is to produce energy. So you have those two sides. And then the effects are much bigger and longer the more you wait, the longer in the future. You will have sea level rise, which depending on the country, you might start losing shorelines, you might start losing villages, there are small island states that they will be underwater eventually within 100 years or so. So
and these are very vocal in asking others to take responsibility for the climate change because they will disappear as islands, right? So that's serious, it is, this issue.
And it could get more serious. There are studies that show because of climate change, we might end up having population migration, people moving to a better country in the sense of more resilient countries. So, and this is the distinction of impacts from climate change. Impacts might be the same across countries, not necessarily, but it might. But then you might have a country which is much more resilient. They have more money as a government, they might have better infrastructure, more advanced approaches to react to any disaster, while other countries, they might have none of these in place. So this might eventually lead to people trying to move, just the way we see today, from Africa primarily moving through the Mediterranean Sea to Europe, Southern Europe, and so on and so forth.
So who is responsible for climate change, or what is responsible for climate change?
Right. So I think what is clear. Primarily our reliance on fossil fuels.
And fossil fuels are extraction
HFO,
oil.
diesel oil, gasoline, all that series. So they're extracted from the earth,
Exactly.
that has been there for millions of years and then we extract the oil and use it as an energy source primarily. Who's responsible? It's a historical fact. There won't be any naming and shaming. It's just what we call today the developed world, in the sense that they were the first in using that source of energy. And over the last 250 years, they've been producing more and more and more over those 250 years greenhouse gases. And there are numbers that show how much the responsibility of what we have today in the atmosphere came from today's industrialized countries. But there are also emerging economies today that were not industrial at the time or even in the 1990s. But now everything has changed and they're like competing globally. China, India, Brazil, and I'm not singling them out, but they're part of those emerging economies. And their emissions now are quite important, even sometimes more than certain smaller industrialized countries.
So what can we do to mitigate this global warming?
Let's define mitigation first,
Okay,
right? So
good.
mitigation is anything anyone does, including countries, to reduce emissions of those gases. So we said primarily it's carbon dioxide. So anything that is reducing emitting those. Renewable energy, if you install renewable energy, that's one action. So you don't have emissions from the electricity sector anymore. Using public transport, which is a shared transportation system rather than using your car, walking, cycling, reducing waste in general, because waste also eventually produces another type of greenhouse gas, and it's quite known. Methane is even more potent than, more stronger than carbon dioxide. So any action you're taking, and when I say you, it's not necessarily an individual, and I want to touch upon that eventually, that it's a national policies that needs to come in, so that there's more deployment of renewable energy, there's more deployment of energy efficiency requirements in the country, so you're using less electricity in general, you're walking if it's a short distance, long distance traveling, you have an opportunity to use or share a public transport system, so anything that contributes in cutting down from burning primarily the fossil fuels.
We always talk about climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. And so can you explain what are these two concepts?
So mitigation, as I said, what we understand as mitigation is actions that reduces emissions. So this is, in a way, you're fighting not to cause climate change. So this is mitigation in a short answer. Adaptation is you're fighting the impact of climate change. For example, there's a higher temperature in general because of climate change. What can you do to adapt to that higher temperature? It could be, for agriculture, for example, you might bring in different types of cucumber type. So let's say in Lebanon, we're using type A that requires a temperature maximum 20 degrees. I'm just giving an example, and I'm sure it's a wrong example. I'm not an agriculture engineer. But imagine the temperatures will be 25 degrees. You can't produce that cucumber anymore. So then you need to bring in, if it exists, a type of cucumber that can sustain 25 degrees, and you start producing that. This is a very simple way of explaining adaptation. But you can also have a proper infrastructure in place. So climate change, as we said, will cause extreme events like floods, torrential rains in a short time period. So you need to have the infrastructure in place, the drainage system in the streets, to be able to absorb that amount of water coming down from because of the rain, so that you don't have flooding taking place, and so on and so forth. You can have cooling systems adapted to additional heat. You can have your health system protected because of heat. We know that extreme heat causes the elderly primarily as a vulnerable group. It causes sometimes death of those vulnerable groups. So we need to have this system that allows reaching out, including awareness campaigns on what to do when there is a heat wave coming, an extreme heat temperature over 4 days, 5 days temperature staying at 35 plus degrees, for example, which is a climate change effect. So awareness campaigns, depending on what the situation is, having a disaster risk management systems in place when the flood happens, because even though sometimes you have an infrastructure in place, it's good enough, but then flood actually happens. So you need to have a system in the country which brings in together your civil defense, the Red Cross or the Red Crescent coming in, hospital emergency systems running, knowing what to do, who's responsible for what, which even sometimes goes down to local authorities having all these things ready for when the disaster happens, which is similar to an earthquake or any other natural disasters.
Yeah. When countries are taking decisions to plant trees, so this is what? Mitigation or adaptation?
So it plays a dual role.
Okay.
So trees, they do absorb carbon dioxide. So you're reducing, in a way, from the atmosphere carbon dioxide. So it is a mitigation role. But planting trees or growing forests also plays a role in helping insects, for example, helping birds finding habitat. So it has an impact on biodiversity as well. Okay. So which also helps in protecting them from practically climate change. So it does have a dual effect. And most of the time, there's always this discussion of the co-benefit. So it has a dual benefit, mitigation, but also, so reduces from one end emissions. And a lot of companies actually do that. So they calculate how much their emissions are. We can do that. Yeah. It's not a rocket science. And then according to that, they decide to plant trees, which is the purpose. So they're emitting, but then they're absorbing. So they're neutralizing each other. But it has other benefits. Planting trees or growing forests retains your soil. Exactly. So when there's flood coming in, it retains water. So there's a lot of adaptation benefits coming from doing that. So it's one of the few, I guess, examples that does both at the same time.
What are the other actions that are being taken in the region, at least, about these issues?
So when you look at the regional aspect, there's obviously now a bit more pledges coming in from mitigation side. But historically, but also continuing now, there's a big push on adapting to climate change. So it's part of the rhetoric. We will be impacted by climate change. And I don't, well, depending on the country, I don't emit too much. So I need to adapt because even if we stop global emissions today, every single country turns off their emissions today, climate change will happen. So in a way, our today's climate was made by our grandfathers and their grandfathers. And we're today making the future generations' climate. So we will be hit. The question is how hard we will be hit. So there is a certain demand and requirement to adapt. And adaptation is not only for, just to add some more flavor and examples, it's not only from the heat stress or from preparing for the disaster. And you mentioned that, you said water. So we need to have a system that we collect water more efficiently than we do now as a country, us and other countries, to have an efficient infrastructure for the water system, to have reduced water consumption at the household level.
But you said something important, that we inherited
Yep.
the problem today from our grandfathers and mothers, and then so we have to take action now to prepare for the future. So any action that we're taking today, or we have to take today, is it going to benefit us, or it's just like preparing for a better future for next generations?
So very much so. Let's do a short-term and a long-term comparison.
Okay.
Short-term, definitely, if you're installing renewables, you would be saving money. So this helps from a short financial perspective. Within 2-3 years, you will get your money back, and you're okay. At least in Lebanon, this is the situation because the energy is too expensive. But that also has a benefit on your health. Now, we use diesel generators. We have the grid, the power plants, which are using very, let's call them dirty fuels, which they are. So the less you need that, and the less you're using that type of energy source, you have a health benefit coming in. It's the same thing with gasoline, transportation. The less we have cars on the roads, yes, we are reducing greenhouse gases, but we are also reducing harmful toxins and toxic elements which impact your health. So this is a short term, short to medium term. The long term requires a global approach. So individually, a country single-handedly reducing emissions, Lebanon, won't have an impact on the planet. And this is also the difference when we hear about individual actions. Your choice, you want to ride a bicycle because of climate change. You don't want to, emit greenhouse gases. This is excellent. You have your own benefit, but it won't make a difference at the national level in this case. But then if everyone in Lebanon is doing that, it does have an impact on the national level, but not at the global level. But then when every country in the world is taking that action, collectively, it will make a difference.
And we would like to invite all of you who are listening to us or watching us, don't forget to share this episode and other episodes of Energy Espresso, and always to subscribe. So let's talk a bit about carbon footprint. And what is carbon footprint, and what can people do to reduce it?
Well, carbon footprint is how much your action individually is causing carbon emissions. And the concept is can be applied for individuals, for a country, for a sector, for a house, for a country, but also for the planet. So just the way we were talking about. So it all depends on how much you rely on electricity, how much electricity you're consuming, how many kilometers you're driving your car, but also what your car is and what your house equipments are. Imagine if you have a big air conditioning unit, which you might not need, but you have it. So you're using it, which you're consuming electricity. And that electricity consumption has a carbon footprint. How much, eventually, anything we're using, you're burning fuel, and the fuel is emitting a carbon. So you can link back from your kilometers driven, again, depending on your car, or maybe if you're riding a bicycle, then you literally don't have a carbon footprint.
Even if it's electric
no, so
bike?
electric is different because you're
Okay.
charging, but then do you have a renewable system installed at the national level or at your household level? So if you're charging, so again, this comes back to the electric cars as well, right? So imagine you have an electric car, but you're still charging from your diesel generator,
Exactly.
but also from the national grid, which is fossil-based.
So that bike is not clean.
No, but you're displacing emission.
Yeah.
This is the difference. So
Okay.
instead of having emission coming from the diesel generator, for example, which is in your neighborhood, and you inhaling the toxins, and when you're driving, right, instead of having that emission coming from your car, it's coming from the diesel generator or the Zoot power plant, right? You're displacing the source, but you're still emitting. But imagine now if you have your house renewable, there's a renewable power system in the neighborhood, but also your national grid. So zoo is renewable zoo, and then everything is renewable, and you're charging your car. Then this is where you reach into almost no emission. And this is the point of having your choice, but then it might not be enough, right? Because there's a higher national system that needs to come in to help you get to a reduced carbon system.
So I have a question. What does net zero emission mean?
So net zero is very much just like you're having your average grade at the end of the year, and you might have scored 20 on a subject, but then 5 on something else, and then your average is 12.5, right? So think that as the net value, net zero, but then your average is 0 in this case, which is a good thing. It's not a negative thing.
Yeah.
So, it might be very hard to get to no emissions, and I'm using no instead of 0 for purpose. No emissions might be very difficult, at least in where we are now, technology-wise. We still don't have those technologies to allow literally to go to no emission at all. So there will be certain amount of those carbon dioxides being emitted. But as you mentioned the one example, the forestry sector, right? And the forestry sector absorbs the carbon. So imagine now you reduced as much as possible, but you still have 10 CO2 being emitted. You're still not net zero, right? Then you go and increase your forest area, which absorbs the 10. And then you get to a net zero value. So it's just, obviously the push is to reduce as much as possible, because we cannot install or actually plant forests forever. So, your balance is 0, your average is 0.
So can renewable energy serve as one way to fight climate change?
It is the major sector that emits. And we talk about energy, it's not only electricity.
Exactly.
So you have the transport,
buildings,
aviation, maritime freight, so the shipping sector. So it's energy, right? It's much wider than electricity only. Heating demand, the buildings, as you mentioned. It is an important part of the puzzle, but it is not the only puzzle in the bigger picture. Definitely, and this is why the drive is on the energy sector itself. It is very important, major emitter globally. In Lebanon, it's, if you account with transports, that's 75% of Lebanon's emissions. So electricity, energy, transport collectively. Agriculture sector, when you use fertilizers, you emit carbon dioxide. So it's not only one energy sector, but it is the most important sector. But gradually, with what we refer to as decarbonization of the sector. And I think this is important as a message. Climate change mitigation, it's not a matter of not using electricity. It's decarbonizing the system, removing the carbon from that energy source. So this is why we talk about photovoltaic, so solar energy, wind energy, hydropower, which literally still they will give you the electricity that you want, but without the carbon. So it's a decarbonization approach of things, which goes across sectors.
So what is Lebanon doing, or the Lebanese government, what steps they're taking to reduce or to combat climate change?
So reduce emissions and combat. So this is mitigation adaptation now.
I'll get there.
So let's start with mitigation, because it's much more concrete in the sense that it's number-based. So back in 2015, under the Paris Agreement, Lebanon submitted its commitments in reducing as a target greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2030 by a good 20% and 31% eventually in 2020 version of the commitments of Lebanon. Obviously, this is a whole of a country effort, but again, there's a specific target for the renewable sector, renewable energy specifically, where it is, the number 18% from national efforts, and then the number 30% as renewable targets by 2030 are the Lebanon's official targets, which are, they have equivalent numbers. So they're not floating numbers. In a sense, Lebanon will have to generate renewable electricity between 6,000 for the 18% up to 10,000 gigawatt hour to meet its 30% target. The importance is on the values and not the percentages. Just to give you an example, in 2018-19, Lebanon's electricity demand was around 18,000 gigawatt hour. Just to give you an example. And today, with the latest numbers that we hear, not confirmed, we already have around a good, I would say, 8-9% renewable generation of electricity. So this needs to continue so that we get into our 2030 targets. So this is one part of actions being taken. We also have transport-related targets under the Paris Agreement. And one of the actions, at least that the government has actually enacted, is part of the budget law. So there is, you pay zero customs and zero excise taxes when you're buying an electric vehicle today. So this is an incentive provided by the government. Hybrid, it still benefits, but you pay, the reduction is 70%, so you only pay 30% of what you should be paying as customs, registration fees, and so on and so forth. So this is a very concrete action that Lebanon has already implemented in the transport sector.
So today, if you're buying a hybrid car, you get a reduction of 70%.
Yes.
And if you're buying an electric car,
100%.
100%
Yes.
free.
You pay 50%, I think, of your registration fee, but then the customs and the import taxes are 0%.
Okay.
There's also a series of high-level messaging for adaptation, in the sense that it comes in and says we need to have, one example, our coastal areas being protected. So imagine you're in a coastal city in Batroun. You're at the shoreline, so you need to build certain structures. You need to avoid building near the shore, so that if there's a storm surge coming in, your house or the venue, whatever it is not damaged by the waves. And we've seen some examples in Lebanon when they actually went beyond the allowed limits and built on the shore. And these are all future potential risks and losses that might happen. So there's a line of protection conceptually coming in those commitments. Obviously, the traditional sectors, very much, again, high-level messaging on the need to adapt in the adaptation in the agriculture sector, looking for alternative crops, bringing in food security. We saw what happened with the Ukrainian war when we had no wheat available for it was almost a crisis globally. So Lebanon needs to protect itself from future shocks. This is also part of adaptation. And then all these, which are, again, high-level commitments, are detailed by relevant ministries, strategies, and plans. So, for example, if you look at the Ministry of Agriculture's plan, you see the different items there. Water-related conservation, extending drip irrigation to reduce water consumption in the agriculture sector, water demand at the same time, looking at, again, those alternative crops, installing greenhouse rooftops to collect rainwater when it rains. So, just a bit more details come in, but these are more defined specifically in the ministerial plans and strategies.
So, and do we have like a figure or a number of how much will this cost Lebanon to transform its whole, I don't know if it's transformation in mechanisms or transformation in economy or all these plans, like how much will it cost Lebanon?
So the cost estimation is done on two sides. So one from expecting a climate impact. So literally economic cost of the climate change in Lebanon, which is in billions of dollars. And 2040 is a good estimated $50 to $60 billion.
We need to spend that
No,
much?
this is the impact, cost of the climate change.
The impact,
right?
okay.
So how much we will be impacted.
Again, give me the number again.
Around $40 to $60 billion.
Wow.
So depending on how you calculate, how you look at it. But how much it will cost Lebanon to reach its 2030 targets, electricity sector is, or the energy sector is around $5 to $7 billion. But overall, initial estimations that were done a couple of years back is somewhere around $12 billion.
Wow.
So this is 3-4 years back.
Yeah.
I mean, energy will not cost that much anymore because the renewable is cheaper now. So just to highlight that point. And there's also another important element that we need to bring into this discussion. There's always a way of what we refer to climate proofing national development plans. In the sense that, and I can give you an example, right?
So, because what is climate proofing?
Right, so think of climate proofing by definition is how you take into account climate in anything you're doing. You're rehabilitating your airport, and there are discussions in Lebanon. You can design the new airport in a normal way, but you can climate proof it in the sense that you design it energy efficient design, but also you install photovoltaic, let's say, integrated into the building. So this is a climate proof approach. So we've done such a series of possible options where Lebanon can benefit of this climate proofing concept. And if Lebanon implements and puts the $12 billion for the 2030 target, it would save around 3 times over 20 years. So it's true, you're paying for this additional climate investment, right? $12 billion. But your savings is 3 times more over 20 years or so. So this is also important if Lebanon is looking forward as a new economy, green economy. You invest now, not in one day, not in 1 year, obviously, in a decade or so, $10, $12 billion that would save on the future generations a good, at least 3 times that amount.
So another question maybe on the climate financing. How attractive is Lebanon for funders to invest in Lebanon, looking at the conditions that we're living in and looking into the idea that because today everything is almost failing in the country, that there is an opportunity to build better. A reaction on that as well. Definitely
this is an opportunity. I know we're in a bad situation as a country, but this is the opportunity. And I think coming in as an eventually IMF deal, that deal should be green, what we call green recovery. And we're hearing about this green recovery concept, where literally everything is, at least from a climate perspective, so green is not only climate, it's climate proofed. So you take into account building the port of Beirut, but then it is all integrated with the renewable, for example. You can imagine the space, how big it is. It could probably take 25 megawatts of electricity, of PVs. So you can imagine now rebuilding the port, but then you have powered by PV. Offshore wind, onshore wind. Investment-wise, it's extremely attractive. Yeah. So, because at the beginning we introduced you as like you're an advisor to the Ministry of Environment. Is this the spirit that you're seeing in the ministry and other ministries about like selling Lebanon as an opportunity, even if there, as a green opportunity, if we want to say, even if we have all these problems? Is there like a vision to sell that at least
Lebanon going to COPs, being part of negotiations, etc., or being with funders, and maybe you've been in discussions with the donors that are coming interested. Do we have that, or it's just like individuals thinking of that?
So again, as investors, it's the banking sector or the financial crisis which is hindering. Otherwise, investment-wise, it makes sense. I doubt there's a country in the world that the payback period of the renewable is small scale at least, or medium scale is this short. But we won't see large investments with the government, for example, as EDL being the off-taker for the time being, because of the economic financial situation of the country. Otherwise, it is, the opportunity is there.
Let me ask you a question about the future. How will climate change affect our future?
Lebanon, it's a modeling system, right? It's a computer model that gives you the results. We're going for mid-century, so 2050, to see 2.2, 2.5 degrees increase in temperature in Lebanon, with a good around 10% reduction in rainfall. They might not look much, but at least if you put these two together, we will have economic impacts on specifically the industry sector in Lebanon and the agriculture sector in Lebanon. So it's very important with the 2 degrees and the 10% rainfall decrease to prepare at least these two sectors, the industry and the agriculture sector, which goes back to adapting to expected impacts of climate change.
Let's talk a bit about the conference of parties, or what we know as COP. So what is the importance of COPs, and what is COP in general, and how is it related to climate change?
Right, so the COP is, as the name is, right? It's a place where, and a time where all member countries come together to meet and discuss treaty, what needs to be done, where we are, what's the global progress in dealing with climate change. And that is not only mitigation and adaptation, there's climate finance, technology transfer. So countries come together to discuss progress in general and to take new decisions looking forward. And this is based on an agreement that has been signed in 1994. So from that day and onwards, countries come together and detail the agreement. So it's an annual meeting that happens where member countries, 190 plus, they join together and they negotiate specifically on new texts, new agreements, new positions, new ways to go forward in dealing with this climate change issue.
So you said then they take decisions, or they review decisions, or they commit. Are we in a place that we still need new commitments, new pledges, or we're done with that? It's about implementation now going forward.
Well, both. Two phases or two parallel work. Implementation needs to happen, because if we don't implement today, it will be too late. We will have bigger climate impacts coming in. But new pledges are also needed, because what is already pledged is not enough. In the sense that if we implement what has been pledged already, we will get to 3.5 degrees increase in temperature. Or our target is maximum 2 degrees global, with a push to a 1.5 degree increase in temperature. We're already at 1.1 degree increase. So the margin is very small. But this is also part of the Paris Agreement mechanism in general, that every country needs to come and update and bring in new and stronger pledges. Lebanon, for example, in 2015 submitted its pledges, but we're supposed to, and we will have to, come up with a new pledge in 2025 for the year 2035. So it's a cyclical thing. Every 5 to 10 years, we have to come with stronger pledges because we know that we're far from our global targets, and then more and more needs to be done.
So Vahaken, we're almost close to the end, and usually the ritual is like when we're close to the end, we ask our guests and experts how they imagine Lebanon in the future. So for you, the task is to imagine and to tell us how will Lebanon look like in 2050. Lebanon 2050, Vahaken, tell us what you see.
Right, so I imagine Lebanon to be 100% renewable based. With public transport, the main mode of transportation, walkable cities where you don't need to have even the use of public transport, where every house has a rainwater harvesting system, every greenhouse plantation has a rainwater harvesting system, where every household is also equipped with energy efficient equipments, but also water efficient equipments, where the banking sector is only giving out loans unless it is a green or climate project or climate positive project. The available cars on the market is only electric because our electricity is 100% renewable. Our central bank is imposing monetary policies that are climate positive. And the entire government's public procurement system is a green procurement system.
Heaven on earth. Vahaken Kabakian, thank you very much for being our guest on Energy Espresso Season 2. وللجميع لكل اللي عم بيتابعونا أن عم بيحضرونا أو بيسمعونا، شكرا لمتابعتكم. ما تنسوا دائما أنه تتابعونا على يوتيوب أو على مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي لإنرجي إسبريسو بالموسم الثاني. لاقونا بحلقات جديدة وشكرا وإلى اللقاء.